Have you ever wondered why people respond to stress and hardship the way they do? Maybe a friend, a family member, a colleague. We've all had those experiences and you just can't wrap your head around it. If you answered yes to any of that, this episode is perfect for you. I'm Mariano, a social work student passionate about mental health and healing. Trauma is something that really affects a lot of people, yet it's often overlooked in how deeply it can shape our behaviors, emotions, and even physical health. In this episode, I'll break down what trauma theory is, what the research says about it, and how it fits within social work and my thoughts on using it in practice. Trauma theory is all about understanding how overwhelming or distressing experiences impact a person's well-being. Trauma is not just about a single bad event. It's about how the body and mind process that event. For example, envision someone who was just in a really bad car accident. How do you think they will feel every time they get in a car afterwards? Even though they're safe in the moment and the odds are they will be fine, they might envision themselves getting in a car accident again, having anxiety, constant fear. And that's because honestly, the trauma, it changed how the brain perceives danger. Trauma isn't a single-sided coin, however. There's different types of trauma. Acute trauma, that comes from a single event, something like a natural disaster, or imagine someone being assaulted. Chronic trauma, that happens over time. So think of a child who had to grow up in an abusive household for 17, 18, 19, 20 years, unfortunately had to endure that. Then there's complex trauma. That comes from repeated harm. So imagine someone in an abusive or toxic relationship. A person who has experienced racism, poverty, or domestic violence over many years, they might have a trauma response that affects their daily life without even realizing it. When people go through trauma, their nervous system reacts automatically. You've probably heard of the famous phrase, fight or flight, right? But did you know there was actually four? There's fight, there's flight, there's freeze, and there's fawn. Some people become aggressive, and that's fight. Some avoid situations, that's flight. Some people shut down completely, as you can imagine, that's freeze. And others, they just become overly accommodating. For example, a child who grows up in a home where anger leads to violence, they might develop a fawning response, always trying to keep the peace, even at their own expense. So what if I told you, trauma's not just stored in our mind, how most people think. It's actually stored in our body as well. And that's the most important idea in trauma theory. And to me personally, that's super interesting because the norm is trauma's a mental thing. Oh, it's just in your mind. That's how most people perceive it. But it's actually quite the contrary. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that I highly recommend, by the way, it explains how trauma can cause real physical symptoms. Things like chronic pain, headaches, and even digestive issues. This is why therapy approaches like EMDR and somatic therapy focuses on healing not just thoughts, but bodily sensations as well. That's something to think about. Research backs up a lot of what the trauma theory says. Studies using brain scans show that trauma affects the amygdala, the part of the brain that detects threats, making it more sensitive. The hippocampus, which processes memories, can actually shrink, making it harder for people to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. This is why someone with PTSD might react strongly to something as simple as a loud noise. It triggers a response like if they're back in that same danger as before. In social work, trauma theory fits perfectly because it shifts the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. That change in perspective can make a huge difference. Imagine working with a teenager who keeps skipping school. Instead of assuming they're just lazy or unmotivated, a trauma-informed approach will consider whether they feel unsafe at the school or if they're dealing with instability at home. Trauma-informed care is a framework that many social workers use. It's based on 5 key principles: safety, choice, collaboration, trust, and empowerment. Whether working in child welfare, mental health, or community outreach, social workers need to recognize trauma, avoid re-traumatizing, and help clients regain a sense of control over their lives. So now this leads us to the question, would I personally use this theory? Absolutely. As someone who wants to be a therapist, understanding trauma is essential. I've seen firsthand how trauma can shape someone's lives, especially in marginalized communities where systemic oppression adds another layer to individual trauma. Trauma theory, it helps explain behaviors that might seem irrational at first, but make perfect sense once we know what somebody has been through. You know, for me personally, I feel like one of the most impactful and powerful things we can do as human beings is really consider what others may have been through or have been through if we do know before we make judgments, because a lot of times it's really easy to see things from our personal lens, our bias, what we've been through, what has our life been like, right? And really, we can never know what it's been like to live in their shoes, why they made certain decisions, why they do certain things. And I think the more we practice empathy and compassion, the world will really drive forward to a better place, because people are not their circumstances or even how society may label them. People are human beings living on this earth for the first time, just like everyone else that may have had unfortunate circumstances, or maybe they have made mistakes. But mistakes are made to be learned from, and we can go from there. So with that said, I will definitely incorporate trauma-informed care into my practice, making sure my clients feel safe and understood. I also believe in focusing on resilience, helping people recognize their strengths and not just their struggles. Trauma theory, that's important, but it's just as important to remind people that healing is possible. So now, I want you to envision someone that you met in the past that you did not know anything about, that now you have a good relationship with. And I want you to think about your initial judgments. What did you think about this person? What led you to think those things? And now, how did it change after you spent time with this person? You got to know more about their life, about their story, about who they really are. And I want you to remember, now knowing what you know, how are you going to take this information with you forward with the next person you might meet, or the next person you might have the opportunity to help or associate with? A lot of times in life, we don't really recognize what someone has really been through or why they are the way they are. We can be very reactive, and that's where the lack of empathy and compassion really comes in. But if we all practice these things and keep in the forefront of our mind, we don't know what someone has been through, then that will lead us to not only make better judgments, but better decisions. I hope you've all enjoyed this podcast. Take care, and remember, stay curious and compassionate.